David, thanks for joining Legacies Lunch Hour live. Although it's not lunch hour where you are.
Close. Well,
It's close
it's
enough.
brunch. We're having
Close enough.
brunch.
Always good to catch up with you, my friend. You've been on the pod a few times. I haven't shifted formats, although I've added a format, which is this live lunch hour. Individuals can ask questions live of our guests. I do thank you for joining us. I know you're a busy guy, but it's always great to catch up.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks for having me. Love watching the show and seeing how things have evolved so far.
I think it's, I've said this and I don't joke about it, but I've said it like if I need any information about the industry, I either reach out to you or I just follow Stratcann. It's that simple. I don't know how you do it. How do you do it? Let's start with that. How do you keep up with all the news in the industry? Because it's not just Canada, you're paying attention global as well. Has the team expanded? Because it used to be David, myself, and I, and then you had expanded a bit. But how are you keeping up with all of that?
Yeah, same as usual. I mean, this is what I do and what I'm plugged into. I'm trying. My goal this winter is to teach myself how to automate more of these things. It seems like we're at a place where those tools are readily available, and maybe it's time to update my old man knowledge. But yeah, I mean, just sort of Google searches and listening to people in the industry and constantly having conversations and getting tips and hearing what's going on and knowing the space well enough to be able to cut through the signal or through the noise to the signal. I think that's the biggest issue,
Yeah,
and
for
that's
sure.
something, frankly, I think would be a challenge to program. I'm trying to wrap my head around how to
Yeah,
do.
it would be tough. Outside the old school RSS feeds that we used to get and understanding what was going on, who's reporting on what. But you seem to have an insight, and I would assume individuals also send you information to say, "Hey, do you know this is going on?" I know people do it to me, and I'm like, "Hey, guys, I can't get this out quick enough. Like this just doesn't make sense." But again, I do appreciate you joining. Multiple topics. I know we moved into it at first. I'm just like, I just want to get you live. We'll figure out what to talk about. And we kind of joked, we're going to talk about things. But there's always something going on in this industry, both locally and globally. But first, let's start with I was going to pull out my old pink paper, my old MMAR, just to have it because there's some shit going on with inspections as of recent. Seems, I don't want to say Health Canada, but Health Canada derived or driven crackdown on home grows. And under home grows, I'll say most transition, I think, into the Cannabis Act, but maybe bring us up to speed of what's going on, why it's going on. And then I'll add in, it's always been going on. But anyways, plant numbers, plant counts, arrests, busts, everything's going on right now. Tell us a little more if you could.
Yeah, as you mentioned, this isn't necessarily new, but I would say more of kind of an ongoing evolution of the type of enforcement Health Canada has been doing, and specifically on personal and designated grows. So a lot of what people these days will call ACMPR. You made a reference even to MMAR. Everything is technically sort of captured under the Cannabis Act
Yeah.
these days, unless you're one of those 30,000 from the Allard ruling. But,
Hi.
yeah, exactly. But beyond that,
I've moved
technically is all
though. I've
captured under
moved,
the
so I
Cannabis Act.
technically can't grow anymore.
Right, right. Yeah, that's you were anchored to the address you were at the time,
That's
right?
right. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So yeah, sorry,
But
continue.
we've been seeing more enforcement at least bubbling up in the news, which I
Mhm.
think is interesting. Police in Ontario, seems like not just OPP, I think RCMP in Ontario as well. I may be mistaken there, I might be misspeaking, but police in Ontario certainly reporting references from referrals from Health Canada as being what has triggered a raid, usually resulting in seizure of plants, dried cannabis, as well as
Mhm.
arrests. And this is, I think, reflecting, like I say, a larger enforcement approach that Health Canada has been taking to better police what they see as people misusing the personal and designated system for maybe personal profit.
Mhm.
Something that maybe is not without precedent. And more recently, and this is unconfirmed, but I've been speaking with someone who has said they've been hearing about inspections, not
Mhm.
police present necessarily, but inspections here in British Columbia as well. And
Interesting.
Health Canada has been updating. The only numbers I have are about a year old now, but Health Canada does publish annually those inspection figures. And starting a few years ago, they really ramped up their inspection of personal and especially designated grows
Mhm.
based on a number of criteria, a lot of it having to do with plant count,
Yeah.
as well as you know they've been looking at the physicians that have been behind a lot of the referrals for pretty high gram counts. That was sort of stage one. I think we're
Mhm.
now in stage two where we're seeing much more in-person inspections and referrals and things like that. We may be entering another stage at some point where they kind of I don't want to say ramp up, but they continue to increase pressure to try to kind of carve off maybe what they see as some of the more egregious examples of people operating outside of the boundaries of what that system is, actually designed for.
Yeah. I mean, it was a great system. It still is, in my opinion. Obviously, there are opportunities in there. I remember back, God, it must be, it was 2013, I think. No one wanted that job of inspector, right? In those days, and this is way pre Cannabis Act. I mean, they're just a target at that point in time, but there was no inspections actually being done. And if you were to take that role as inspector, I'm just thinking organized crime, right? You've got one individual that knows where all the grow locations are throughout any particular province. Yeah, they'd be a target as far as I'm concerned. But outside of that, do you think is this Health Canada's, without them publicly coming out and saying it, like they're hearing the industry, they're hearing the competition, it's tough to operate, and now they're starting to crack down a little bit? Or is it just something that was natural? Because I knew, if I think back, and I don't know, I don't want to misquote it, but Derek Pedro, I mean, one of the highest gram per day allotment ever heard of, justifiable, at least the way that he went through it. I think it was over 100 grams per day potentially, but still, that's what it was. And are they targeting the physician side? Because I know that there have been fines issued on the physician side, but where's it coming from? Where is it born from? Is it all the chaos in the industry, the legal side saying, "Hey, we've got to do something here. Please do something," or is it just their time and they finally are getting around to it?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. I really don't think it's certainly not exclusively pressure from industry, and I don't think it's a reaction to anything going on right now. I think it's
Mhm.
more, like I say, an evolution of something they've been working on for many years, and I can speak to that, with a bit of experience, just kind of understanding how long these processes take.
Mhm.
I think Health Canada was initially a few years ago really putting pressure on the provincial colleges of physicians, saying, "Hey." In the same way they would with if, for example, they were looking at a doctor that was prescribing an inordinate amount of opioids or something, saying, "Hey,
Right.
this is out of the norm. Would you guys like to take a look at that?" I
Mhm.
think I wouldn't necessarily say stage two or stage three. I don't know the order, but I think after that pressure campaign of focusing on those colleges of physicians, I think looking at the track record and some of the reports they've given out, it seems like one of their next stages was those in-person inspections. And as I
Mhm.
say, that's been picking up over the last couple years. And then starting, I would say 10 months ago is when I started seeing these news reports of police in Ontario saying, oh, it was a referral from Health Canada that directed us to look at that. And I would say that's probably an example of another stage.
Yeah.
And so none of this would be, oh, some producer called us up or industry called us up and said we need, this would have been years and years in the making. And really, I
Mhm.
think it's more driven by political concerns. Frankly, partisan politics, conservatives for years at all levels of government have complained about this. Not just conservatives, but tend to be the ones that really push it the most. It sort of fits within their demographic more. But when I worked with Health Canada and did meetings with municipalities, I would hear from city councilors who would complain about lack of enforcement. So it's been
Yeah.
something that's been an issue for many years of a perception, often based in reality. As you said, there used to be very few inspections, and for some of the reasons you mentioned, law enforcement and safety concerns being one. Something clearly shifted a few years ago where they finally had the opportunity to say, okay, this is getting out of hand. Um, we can put some political capital into trying to wrangle this.
Mhm.
I think it's probably just smart politics because they recognize it's giving their opposition a lot of ammunition.
Yeah.
I do think that the people within Health Canada that helped develop that system would rather preserve it rather than seeing kind of the baby being thrown out with the bathwater. And so I think
Mhm.
all of those things combined are really more behind it as opposed to it being industry concerns. I think you do. I think Health Canada does hear that from industry in a vague sense. Hey, you have to do something about the black market.
Mhm.
Health Canada's perspective is largely that's a law enforcement issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not our problem.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing I hear is from retailers more than producers these days. Once in a while, you hear sort of a tone deaf pubco CEO mention something about the black market, but for the most part, it's retailers of all sizes now that I
Yeah.
hear,
Yeah.
especially in Ontario, complaining about why the hell are the local police not doing anything about this.
Yeah, for sure. So, how does this tie in and relate then to, because there's been an increase in size limitations for micros? Is there a gap now in compliance when it comes to this? Like, let's be real. A lot of the micros that moved in are previous illicit operators. Love them. Okay. Love them. Was one. That's live. But is there an issue that's starting to bubble up potentially, or what are we going to see with that potential increase? And I know that there have been a lot of applications lately, and we've seen some that have been permitted. But is there a gap in compliance now potential?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things I wonder if Health Canada fully contemplated when they changed those micro rules and allowed it to expand by four is the potential for abuse given the relative lack of oversight of a micro grow versus a standard grow, specifically with things like cameras.
Hmm.
Um, there's I will tie it back to our previous conversation or our previous topic because I think it all ties together in that in the same way that we're starting to hear more reports of a lot of these people who've been operating under designated grows for a long time now starting to get inspections where, as you know, historically there was very few. And so
Hmm.
when there's very few inspections, it's very easy to get used to going around the rules and get
Hmm.
very complacent maybe. And so I think some of these people who are now seeing inspections, it's an important wake up call. And I think on the micro side, there's something to be said there as well that one, there's been very few inspections of micros in general. There's just a lot of licenses. Health Canada got really behind the ball during COVID. That really kind of shook everything up. And now in the last few years, they're really trying to ramp up more in-person inspections. But I personally know micros that have gone years
Hmm.
with since they've been licensed and not had any kind of in-person inspection. And I think that maybe breeds similar complacency, where
Yeah.
especially if you're one of those micros who's come from personal designated space, and so you're for many years, you can get used to the idea that, hey, the rules are just a suggestion. There's very little consequence if I break them. And that may very well be, people's practice today. And so my concern is that, increasing that, and now you could operate with four times as much cannabis on site.
Hmm.
Um, I would be worried for those folks who maybe say, okay, I can just continue to do this at even a larger scale now. My concern is twofold. One, has Health Canada properly contemplated that? Two, if they have, I worry about those license holders who maybe have become complacent and think that
Hmm.
they can continue to operate a bit free and loose. And, at some point you may get that surprise inspection where not only if your books aren't in order, but if you're in the process of, moving something in or out of the back door, let's say metaphorically, I think people just need to kind of be on their toes. But yeah, I think that's something in a broader sense we'll have to keep an eye on over the next few years. There's
Yeah.
certainly, you talked about people bringing things to you as a reporter, and I get a lot of that. A lot of, I wish I could cover everything that everyone threw our way, but
Hmm.
there's certainly long been rumors for a while of the ability to, destruct product, and some of the ways that export ties into that. That I think may be a rude awakening for the inspector and or some license holders at some point down the
Yeah.
road. And, one of these larger publications will cover it in a probably more sensational way that is intended to discredit the larger system
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
whole.
Totally, yeah, yeah, and we can leave that to them as well, right? I think that, relationships go a long way in this industry. But remember, I worked compliance for the longest time, so I could see in the software what was going on at some of these companies. And it's funny that maybe not so funny. I don't think those at the helm think this is funny, but the larger, producer processors, they'll see 3, 4 inspections sometimes, and a micro can go a year, 2 years, or never. I don't understand that, but I think the biggest thing to call out here is what you said. I'm not illegal is illegal activity. Okay, we'll just push that to the side. It's making sure that all of your records are up to date, because if they do a surprise inspection, it's the worst. I've been on site for them. It's a nightmare. It's chaos. It's trying to figure things out because, and it's not all inspectors are created equal, but the inspectors aren't necessarily coming in just to try and shut you down. They are asking questions and they are asking for evidence. And if you can't supply it, that's where the issues start to arise. So,
And it's not
let's,
just Health Canada. I was talking to a licensed producer the other day who said, my big concern these days is CRA. And
oh
that's not to
God.
say they're coming after you either. It's just that they are doing a lot more very targeted, detailed inspections. It sounds like than even Health Canada is.
Yeah.
And again, if for a few years, if you're someone who was licensed right around COVID, it's very likely that you went several years with no inspection.
Mhm.
And if you come from a spirit of noncompliance anyway,
Yeah.
I think it can be very easy to kind of get set in those ways. And that might work in the short term, but it might not. It might kind of bite you in the ass down the road.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. If we could, David, I wouldn't mind shifting just because you have a lens of the global industry, and I want to tie this back to export a little bit. But there's a lot of weird shit going on lately with some retraction. Germany, Australia's changing things a little bit. Can you recap maybe for us what you're seeing globally? Why potentially, and I don't know if it's just due to government change or shifting government, but what's going on, and then opportunities that were there maybe are not there anymore for the Canadian producer processors?
Yeah, I think, kind of two parts to that question, but I think what you're talking about in the first part of your question, what I'm certainly seeing is more evidence of a shift in some of the politics around legalization
Yeah.
and cannabis policy. And I think there was a high watermark there, maybe, the U.S. legalizing Colorado and Washington 2012 to
Mhm.
2014, those systems coming in place, then Trudeau coming in and promising legalization taking place in Canada. Prior to that, Uruguay also legalized. And so I think there was a lot of hope of this sort of inevitability of this momentum. What we are seeing now, and one of the examples I would give is just more opinion pieces I'm seeing in media. I read one yesterday of, legalization in Canada was a mistake. And it was
Mm.
obviously a very biased, very sort of
I want
conservative
names.
perspective on this. I'll probably be writing something in the next couple
Yeah.
months because I've been sort of gathering my thoughts on this issue and want to document it. But I'm using these as an example of something that I'm seeing. We're at the beginning of maybe a bit more of a social conservative pushback against the concept of legalization, not necessarily
Mm.
cannabis. And I understand cannabis legalization itself is still very popular. I think a Pew poll came out the other day that some of the outlets in the US have covered talking about how popular legalization is. I think more popular than religion or something like that.
Yeah.
A very broad sense
Sure.
legalization. As
Yeah.
soon as you drill into what it means and how it should be implemented, I think it's a little different. I think watching how Trump touches or doesn't touch the topic of legalization will be very informative because he's ultimately setting the tone in those circles, I think.
Mhm.
But I think it's something people have to pay attention to. There is not this inevitable wave of legalization. We've seen pushback now in Germany, which you mentioned. There was a legalization referendum in New Zealand a few years ago that failed. We're starting to see a little bit of pushback, at least in the medical system in Australia, and Australia's efforts at non-medical legalization have failed.
Mhm.
Um, I, this, I think maybe easy mode is over, and now it's going to be a bit of a grind in terms of policy because we're starting to see uh, governments forming that are much more socially conservative, and there
Right.
continues to be a significant amount of support for those messages from their base. And I think that's something we forget. I think it's really easy to sort of fall for the narrative of, oh, all conservatives are just for small, limited government and they just want to like protect their weed crops with their guns. I think the reality of partisan politics is one where there's still a lot of that social conservative sentiment. It
Mhm.
hasn't gone away, and I think there's an opportunity maybe for a bit of a backlash against how much progress we have made, which seems inevitable to any social progress. There's
Yeah.
that opportunity for pushback. So I think people should plan around that, and that does certainly tie into the second part of your question about how export impacts the Canadian market. there was an enormous amount of excitement because of the progress in Germany. The most recent election has tempered that a little bit, and that is having some impacts on at least the expectation of where the market will be in a few
Mhm.
years. And practically speaking, what I'm hearing from folks who are operating in the broker space is that maybe that high water mark in terms of overall demand is starting to wane. A lot of export was really driven by Australia for quite a while. As that was starting to die down, Germany happened to open up in a big way, and so there's a lot of excitement there. But
Yeah.
now, without another big country coming on, I think it will be difficult to maintain that momentum. And so when I
Mhm.
talk to growers here who are looking to just enter the market, especially the micros and craft guys that I talk to, again, I'm always saying, you need to be cautious. Don't put all your eggs in that basket. It's what I've been telling them for years. And so maybe you will get lucky, but
Yeah.
it's not going to be a long-term goal. And I
Luck's
think
a big
increasingly,
gamble, man. Luck is a
yeah,
massive gamble in this industry.
yeah. And
Like,
if you're a well-established grower who's consistent and you have those contacts, that's one thing. And I've talked to some of those folks who seem like they're doing great. But if you're someone who, you're scrambling, there's,
mhm.
the domestic market is challenging, and you're kind of hoping for a Hail Mary at export. I mean, it's worth a try, but a lot of the excitement seems to be dying down. And what I've heard from some of the folks is that it's moving to more of a value market as well, which makes
Mm.
sense because once that saturation point hits, then similar to where we were a couple years ago in Canada, prices are going to drive down.
Yeah.
And we're also at a place in the global economy where consumers are, pinching their pennies as well,
Yeah,
even
yeah.
consumers.
So a couple things on that then. So Germany, I think, was the largest opportunity for export for Canada. Maybe still is. Israel had kind of trailed in there, and then all that shit went down. I don't know what else is going to happen there. What other markets potentially open up? Because there are some license holders in Canada that their entire business model is export. That's it. They established as an exporter, they do export. And if that starts to recede, obviously we know what happens. But what are the other opportunities? What other markets potentially then outside of Germany and Australia was huge for the longest time for many as well. But
There are certainly some other smaller emerging markets. I would recommend talking to some of the brokers who could get into some of the weeds on that. I don't,
Mhm.
but in the big picture, I don't see anything able to replace the momentum that was first Australia, followed by Germany. I just can't imagine. There's a lot of eyes, I think, on UK,
Mhm.
and there's some potential there. But again, um, not necessarily the headwinds that we had a few years ago, politically speaking. So I wouldn't have a lot of expectation there. So it's hard to see what other large country would be able to replace that sort of momentum.
Yeah.
Other than the U.S., and that would obviously be a massive sea change.
Mhm.
But even if suddenly something were to happen tomorrow, and Trump is known for going off script, so it's very possible. But even then, the 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 logistics, the complexity of the reality of putting all of those things into place to harmonize something as large as the United States, I think I haven't seen a lot of analysis that truly appreciates how complicated that would likely need to be for
Mhm.
it to be functional in the same way that a truly regulated market like Canada is functional. And talk to people about the complexity of export here, even through the legal system. Now imagine trying to harmonize all these different state rules, many of which are sort of Wild West.
Mhm.
So that's to say, I can't imagine what would be a comparable country to something like Germany.
Yeah. Well, and many from the US especially have used Canada as a jumping point to get to export, whether that's through, vape product, finished goods, flour in some cases, but express of the brand, that's one thing, establishing roots as a brand in another country. We've seen Cookies has done this. Cookies seems to they do well regardless. I think that's also backed by Burner, but that would clearly create more complication. But where's the cultural war potentially shifting or coming from when it comes to all of this?
I mean, I think that goes back to your previous question in terms of that shifting narrative, where I think for a while the pro legalization narrative was winning out, and I think we took that for granted. And I think that there's certainly an opportunity for, and I'm seeing signs of that shifting. And obviously the U.S. is at the center of that. And I think a lot of people who assume that Trump is going to legalize, I think, are not maybe taking that into consideration. That there's an enormous part of his base that is still open to a lot of the more sort of reefer madness arguments,
Yeah.
and there's an opportunity for that pushback because it's easy to cherry pick a lot of points. You could very easily go into the data in Canada and paint a negative picture if you wanted to. And I'm seeing examples of that already starting to emerge. We're seeing a little bit of it in the States. We're seeing a lot of conflation with, issues with fentanyl being conflated with cannabis. We've seen there was an MP recently in the House here in Canada a couple months ago who made a similar comment that was sort of conflating cannabis legalization with the
Yeah.
idea that the Liberal government is legalizing all drugs. And so things like that, I think people do need to pay attention to if they're trying to sort of read the tea leaves of what those big shifts will be, and the constant question of if and when the U.S. is going to legalize. Like I say, Trump, you never know. 10 years ago, I would have been much more confident in my projections of what was going to happen politically in the U.S., but I don't think that there's a lot of political capital for him to do it. And I think even if he wanted to do it, it'd be insanely complicated. So uh, I think the industry in general has been moving, with a lot of headwinds
Mhm.
economically and politically, at least in that lead up to legalization around
Yeah.
2018 to maybe 2020. And now this is just yet another example of where now it's going to be a bit more of a slog, um, grinding it out from a business perspective or from a political perspective. And it ties back into a lot of the issues that we've talked about in the past here in Canada,
Yeah.
and getting political support for industry changes like excise tax. People need to take into account that there is not this massive wave of voters that are prioritizing these issues here domestically either.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a couple more questions, but I do see. So it looks like some tech is working for us. I can see some comments this time. Nathan Mizon is asking a question here. Hey, Nathan. So it says there's considerable conversation about Ministry of Agriculture adding cannabis to their portfolio federally, including Health Canada potentially supporting it. How do you believe that that would change the sector?
If that were to happen, I think in a perfect world, great question, Nathan. And that's certainly something people have been wanting to see for years. I would love to see moving cannabis out of just public health. I
Hmm.
I think the realities of it would be pretty complicated, so I wouldn't expect to see any major changes anytime soon. Nathan may be more privy to some inside conversations there than I have. Um, I think that could be a positive depending on how substantive those changes are. Um, the amount of it might have the opportunity to reduce the amount of paperwork and a lot of the oversight that Health Canada requires.
Hmm.
One of my big questions would be how would the jurisdiction be divided up? Because I doubt Health Canada would let go of it completely. Maybe they only hypothetically only look at the medical side and not the non-medical side, or maybe outdoor or greenhouses have an opportunity to have more oversight by agriculture. But I think ultimately it would just be ideally a little bit less of the paperwork and regulations that are built around the original medical framework,
Yeah.
which is, so much mirrors pharmaceutical, which is just not practical for growing plants.
Yeah. We've talked about that a bit before. In an ideal world, we'd love to see a shift potentially, but again, it's all the points that you brought up. It's what does that look like? For me, I'd love to see a resurgence in medical. I know that it's kind of waned a little bit over time. I do think that we may see that, but what the hell do I know?
Well,
Not much.
we just had an article come out, I think today or yesterday, showing medical. It's not declining steeply
Mhm.
anymore. It seems like it's actually somewhat leveling out. But
Leveling out. Yeah.
numbers over the last 6 months or so, continue to decline in terms of registrations, and that's on the LP side, people
Mhm.
registering to order from producers, as well as the personal and designated side. There was a bit of a surge in personal and designated for a minute there, but that's cooling off as well, and may be tied into some of those enforcement things we were talking about
Yeah.
earlier. But yeah, I don't think medical in general is going anywhere. I,
No,
I
no,
think
no,
it
no.
makes sense to me that as a lot of those people who can be served by the non-medical market, they sort of drift out. It's no need to go through all those extra steps. Um, it would certainly make the industry, I think, more competitive and opportunity for more profit if maybe they didn't have all of those medical regulatory standards to
Mhm.
adhere to if they didn't want to deal with the medical side.
Yeah.
And I think there's a legitimate argument to be made there for that. But moving something, I don't even know what the precedent would be there in moving something from Health Canada to Department of Agriculture. Maybe Nathan knows if he's still listening, but is there another file that we could compare that has made a similar shift?
Mm, okay. Well, I will monitor to see if he responds to that. David, I don't think we've had a chance to connect since the craziness of the hemp loophole in the US and how that could potentially play out. I've posted about it. And again, I'm Switzerland in most cases. For anyone that's watching, I don't lean too far left or right for obvious reason. But what are your general thoughts, first of all, on the US hemp? And I say loophole, air quote loophole, because it is technically a loophole in many cases. Let's start with just your general thoughts and then advantageous or not if Canada were to follow suit. Obviously, it's not a loophole in that case. We regulate all cannabinoids, but first thoughts on what's going on in the US with that.
I'll answer that in the reverse order. So there's been a lot of talk about Canada following that path,
Mhm.
since legalization and a lot of hope around it. And I think initially in the first few years, as things unfolded in the States, there was a lot of belief that there would be that economic opportunity in Canada. I think that the regulator, from my opinion, looked rightfully at that as the loophole that it is and the inevitable problems that would ensue.
Mhm.
And I think was smart to be cautious about waiting to see how things unfolded before they jumped into that as well. There's a lot of specific details in there in terms of how to properly monitor the amount of THC in these products. And so from that standpoint, I've always been very skeptical that it's all that practical in an immediate standpoint, just
Yeah.
in terms of the regulations, but
Mhm.
as well as the market opportunity. I think there was a lot of hype around it, especially around CBD and medical CBD and 2016 to 2020. And I think a lot of that market hype has died off. I think we've moved on to, I don't know, kale smoothies or elk meat or something like that. But I think CBD was just one of those things that had its moment, and that interest has significantly waned. And so now, using that example in the States, I think that bears that out in that supposedly um, those rules were developed for the ability for hemp farmers
Mhm.
growing hemp, either for grain, which is seed or fiber, or ostensibly for CBD. What we saw is a ton of crops in the first few years put in the ground growing specifically flower for CBD, which didn't have a market because the demand really wasn't there. Prices cratered. There was way too much supply. And that, uh, arguably, there's a direct line to be had between that and all of the Delta 8 and all of these sort of uh, alternative cannabinoids, let's say, that are flooding the U.S. market and I think undermining state legal products and in some instances undermining people's health.
Mhm.
Um, so I think you can tell from my comments that I don't think the loophole is a good thing,
Yeah.
and I think it was wise of Health Canada, I think, to see that coming and be cautious about it. And because of that, I don't personally think that we'll see many of those changes happening in Canada. Certainly not in any way that would reflect, the way things unfolded in the States. And
Yeah.
personally, I would rather see hemp have the opportunity to actually be hemp. If
Yes.
you're
Yeah.
growing for flower, I think you're growing cannabis, even if it's CBD. Certainly, if
Mhm.
you're growing for cannabinoids, if you're growing for fiber, if you're growing for grain, in the cannabis community, we've talked for decades about all the enormous opportunities that hemp provides.
Mhm.
And then what does the market do? It goes, producing a bunch of this, absolute trash for bulk cannabinoid production in these vape pens that's being marketed to frickin' children. It's
Yeah.
it's ridiculous. So, let's give the actual hemp industry, actual hemp farmers,
Yeah.
an opportunity to actually do that. And we've seen that more here in Canada because it has been regulated for so long. And the reality is it's still in its nascent space. There's
Mhm.
a need for more infrastructure, but also, demand is not maybe at where we thought it was going to be for those types of things either. And so, removing some of the hype from all of those things, from CBD or hemp fiber or hemp seed, and just approaching it as the agricultural product that it is.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I agree with that. And I feel for the operators that are on the legal side of it in the US. And you're right. It's, to me, it undermines that. Because there's just a ton of money that's invested. The public health side of it, that's one that is very difficult. You know, you can go and pick up one of these vapes at a gas station. Uh, we're already challenged on issues in the lab testing and what's going on, both in Canada and the US in some cases. So it's just hard to say. Let me ask you this: is there anything that's popped up over the last couple months that has just taken you or surprised you, I guess, that you were either thinking something was going to play out, didn't play out, or was like, holy shit, I can't believe that that actually happened. I was like, just understanding it from your point of view, because again, you're dialed in. It's just a matter of, has anything taken you by surprise lately?
Well, it's a great question, which is to say I haven't had a chance to contemplate that. So there's probably a lot of great answers, but I'm not. I haven't had enough caffeine yet this morning to
Yeah.
come up with something on the fly. I think one of the interesting, it doesn't fully answer your question, but I think it ties in. It's interesting to see some of the new products that are now starting to come out
Mm,
after the regulatory update earlier this year. And I think maybe one of the things that is surprising me is how uh, one of my metrics for the sort of consumer and bud tender space is the OCS on Reddit, and seeing how few people maybe knew that that was actually a thing. And so
mm,
these products are now, showing up in images, and reading some of the comments, and people are kind of shocked by them. So I think, one, it's really interesting to see how the market is responding to that and some of the products that are coming out, as well as what some of those consumer responses are, but also a good reminder for me that, um, you know, those of us who are really deeply plugged into this space, it's a good reminder that there's still, even people who operate in the industry but aren't, this deeply plugged in and nerded out. Maybe it's an important reminder for us that it's good to, keep communicating these things to people in ways that they can understand it. But what I will say, the Woody Nelson has their, I think was one of the first out. I think Shred has another multi-pack out, and I'm going to be interested to see how it's too early to know how the market will respond to that, but what their
yeah.
sales numbers are like, and if there's a spike in sales, we'll have to see.
What
Some of the clear
what's the
packaging is,
Reddit community saying? But I've gotten away from Reddit. I try to, dude, that is the biggest rabbit hole time suck in the world. Obviously, there's a lot of great points made by consumers, especially. But what's the world saying when it comes to multi-pack? At least the Reddit universe.
I mean, Reddit hates everything. Reddit is very pessimistic, so I think there are some, rightful critiques made in terms of, it's just a bunch of extra packaging.
Yeah.
But again, it goes back to, I think maybe we were talking previous to recording today, but these vocal communities online can be helpful, but it's also important to remember that's not really reflective of the overall market. Anytime I
Mhm.
see conversations about edibles on Reddit or Facebook or Twitter, I see the inevitable cliche complaint about 10 milligrams. But I think, the market is a lot more complicated than that. I think there's a lot of people who are actually, don't have those complaints, and it's not
Mhm.
part of the daily conversation when you're going into a retail store. So we'll have to see how the edibles, how much the actual market responds to that. I do think the Reddit loves the clear packaging for the most
Mhm.
part,
Yeah.
and I think it is going to be an exciting new thing for consumers. I think it's kind of a gimmick, really, more than anything else, and so I think the multi packs for edibles is kind of a gimmick too, and people like gimmicks sometimes. So
Yeah.
I think the question on the edible side will be, will it actually increase overall sales, or is it just going to be that someone buys one of those a month as opposed to coming in once a week and buying a handful? That will be one of the interesting things. And it will be interesting to see if the clear packaging on flower, it'll be difficult to measure, but how much of an impact that has on flower sales, as flower sales are,
Yeah.
declining in the face of extracts and vape pens and all-in-ones, especially.
What are your thoughts on the clear windows and clear packaging opportunity?
I think it's, like I say, it's a good way to refresh and rebrand and get consumers excited about something who've become a little complacent. There's always some new evolution to the market, some new product out. Cannabis consumers really love that, the next new thing. So walking into the store and seeing some clear packaging, I think it's a way to refresh the market in some positive ways.
Yeah. There's some hits and misses. I'll say that. I just, for me, I always look at it as seeing a bud tender. So can I see the package? Great. No, I don't want that one. Can you go get me another one? And the bud tender's running to the back to get another package. No, I don't like that one either. Can you get another one? That's the way I see it. Maybe I'm crazy. I don't know. David, we're what, halfway through the year. What are you looking forward to for the remainder of 2025? What's exciting you? And where do you see some great opportunities?
I think continuing to watch what export does will be one of the most important things within the industry, especially for growers and producers, because that has been such a savior for the last few years, and that appears to be shifting a little bit. So I think how that unfolds will have other downstream impacts. Export has raised prices domestically, and so if export is waning a little bit, or that market is getting saturated, will we see a bit more price compression down the road here?
Mhm.
Um, Continuing to see the push and pull between extracts and flower, I think is something interesting to keep an eye on. One of the things I'm looking at with some of the data from Headset right now is um, sales of edibles in different U.S. states in comparison to their potency limits,
Mhm.
and contrasting that with some of the sales we're seeing in Canada, and so how much truth there is to the idea that edible sales might significantly increase if the potency amounts increased, or maybe that's being a bit overblown. But all of those I think are examples really that there's nothing huge on the horizon. I think it's more just the market starting to sort
Survive. Just
survive and sort
that's
itself
been the
out.
name of the
And
game since day one, almost, really, right? Like it's, well, other than the big cash influx that came in. Yeah, yeah.
on that note, I think something I've been waiting for years, and I keep thinking is right around the corner, is when we're going to see one. Along those lines, when we're going to see one of those big pubcos fail. It certainly seems like at some point they can't keep losing tens and hundreds of millions of dollars every quarter, but somehow they keep
Yeah.
staying afloat.
Well, and I can't remember. I think it might have been Mitchell Osak that I was talking to about this, and he's, as this does not go for all pubcos, but some with the very deep pockets or deep backing is this is still nothing for them. They're going to keep going. They're going to keep surviving. They're going to keep putting money in until there's attrition. There's other companies that die down, and then another cash influx, and they just storm the market. I could see that. I don't like to lose any money, period. But I guess it's a risk at least for them to analyze, and I don't know. It's still tough
I
to
think
watch.
it ties in everything we've been talking about. I think export buoyed a lot of them as well, and I think that's where they're putting all their cash. That's why the last few conferences in Germany and UK have been so popular. That's where all the hope and excitement is, in that sort of speculative pubco space. And so if there isn't another Germany, like we are saying earlier, if I think they're putting all their money on some kind of substantial change in the US, and if that doesn't happen, then I don't know how they can continue running on the hype that they seem to operate on, because I mean,
Yeah.
they're losing money. They have cash in hand because people are continuing to give them money, but people are giving them money based on an assumption there's going to be something big happening. And if that's not inevitable, I guess is the
Yeah. Yeah.
crux of this entire conversation, is none of that is inevitable.
That's totally true. Okay, leave us with this. I always ask this of you. Who's the winner or winners right now, in current state? Because this changes over time. I think there's been a few months since I had you on the pod. Who's winning right now in your eyes? If you're comfortable answering it, because I understand from your vantage points, things are a little bit difficult sometimes, but I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
I mean, I can, answer in a vague sense that I think the companies that are winning continue to be those companies that know how to execute consistently, have a solid business plan. It's not the people who once in a while kick out an amazing crop and are able to actually get it to retailers. It's the people who know how to do that consistently. I think something interesting to watch in the retail space. I mean, everyone focuses on the potential for the domination of the big guys, and that's very real. But I continue to talk to really interesting independent retailers, and one store, handful of stores, but that speak very positively about the future and their space in the market. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there too. So,
Yeah.
the people who know their customer base, who they're growing for, who they're selling to. If you're an ancillary service and you're selling to these other companies, just understanding how to navigate this space and sticking to the fundamentals, I think those will continue to be the people who succeed.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Consistent business fundamentals. It's proven in other industries, so why not this one, right? Listen, David, I appreciate you. I appreciate you dropping knowledge and truths with us. Let's make sure that we don't wait as long next time. We'll get you on more often. I love your insight and your viewpoints of the industry.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, you as well. One of these days, I think we should flip the script, and I'll come on and interview you, perhaps for your viewers.
There we go. That might be interesting. There's some skeletons in that closet. So, listen, buddy, I appreciate you, and I'm sure the audience does as well. So, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye bye.